Excellent. Good afternoon, everyone, and good afternoon, everyone in the room and in the chat. I'm very happy to chair the event of today, which is the second one we had organized under the banner, under the title of Urban Design, Otherwise Conversation. We started last week, last Friday, actually, with a discussion around anti-colonial design, more related to coloniality and the decolonial method with different guests. And today we want to continue on the same tonality of the reflection, opening up to a series of reflection on, again, design, urban and architectural to a certain extent, to think on, broadly speaking, on the notion of crisis somehow, and crisis taken both as a register to interpret the present, but also as a way to understand specific moment around which coloniality and modernity are impacting moments of extractions, disasters, conflicts in different forms of climate and environmental changes, so forth. And in doing so, this sits very well with the discussion we have had last week, of course, but also in the ethos of the conversation. And those conversations, just a reminder before introducing you, the two guests of today that will help us to have a conversation around those topics, is that this series started pretty much during COVID several years back, when we were trying to combine discussions and reflection on topic around urban design, we call it otherwise, in terms of thinking different mode of operation of that complex practice, of course. And we intended this opportunity to engage in a dialogue with current students, but specifically with alumni that have done the course before and have some new experience, new reflection, new research, in dialogue and in discussion with scholars, practitioners, researchers, and other people that could enlighten the reflection. So today, the idea is to reflect on the response from activism, solidarity, research, practice in general, to the notion of crisis. And we ask two scholars and researchers, and of course, one alumni of them, to discuss with us. I'm just introducing very briefly them to you, and then if they want, they could back up and improve and implement more detail on the. First of all, we have Nada Feituri. Nada is an architect, urban designer, and a writer from Libya, Benghazi. She did the BUD course a few years back, under the Chevening Scholarship, and she's working across different research and public practices, both in Middle East and outside. Nada will be in dialogue. She will start the presentation, and Nada will be in dialogue with us, with Marina Otero Verzier, which is the head of the Social Design Masters at the Academy of Eindhoven. And in 2002, she won the Harvard GSD Wellwright Prize for a very interesting project on the future of data storage. She works on curation, on architecture, on practice, and she has beautiful books written on specifically on the lithium and the state of exhaustion, which is probably one of the recent books that she will talk more to. So without any further ado, the dynamic is pretty much the same. Each of you has about 25 minutes to go and present and reflect, and then each of us will have the opportunity to reflect back, to ask questions, to engage into a conversation. Max a couple of hours, an hour and a half, 45, but in any time we'll be in touch. Again, for all the people in the room and in the chat, possibility to ask questions, to intervene after, with the usual means, raising the hands or typing questions into the chat, and we'll definitely re-engage. So without any further ado, thank you again very much for your time. Nada, floors is all yours, and thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Camillo. And hello, everyone. It's nice to be back, even virtually, in the Bud studio. As Camilla mentioned, I did the Bud course 2018, 2019, right before the pandemic. So we were one of the lucky, the lucky groups. I'm just going to share my screen here, show you the beginning of my presentation. So thank you, DPU, Camillo, and Giovanna for the chance to kind of talk about some of my work, the things that I've been doing kind of post-Bud. As Camillo mentioned, I'm from Benghazi in Libya. It's a city where I've spent a lot of my life. It's where my parents are from, and it's where I experienced some kind of extraordinary historical moments. And so I've been kind of documenting and researching and writing about the change over time. It's important to me personally, but I also feel like there's so many interesting lessons that can be taken away from here. So just to give you an idea of what I'm going to be covering today, I want to set the scene a little bit. Where is Benghazi? Where is Libya? It's a country that's often off of the radar of the media and academia and global narratives in general. And I just want to share some of the local context. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what it's like to see a reconstruction process in a city already in crisis. And this is something that isn't unique to Benghazi. These are lessons that are being replicated elsewhere in the region and also globally. Any city that requires reconstruction is a city facing multiple crises, whether it's the aftermath of a conflict or an ecological disaster or a pandemic, as we've seen more recently. But how each city tackles the process depends on its history and context. And it's here where I think some of the lessons from Benghazi can be taken away. I want to talk about the tensions between the narratives that we hear and especially what we've been hearing in Libya generally, whether it's from the United Nations Security Council or Western nation states or just the different actors, and between what people actually need and what people are actually working on. And then I kind of want to open the floor a bit and talk about how we can kind of decolonize or take apart this notion of reconstruction, especially in this kind of brave new world of the post-COVID, post-Ukraine, post-Arab Spring, a world where it's just post. We're always in the aftermath of something. We're always in the midst of something, and we're also in anticipation of a future crisis. So here in Benghazi, it's been 6 years since the war was officially declared over, officially by the people who won one side of the war. Right now, we're in what the UN calls the recovery and reconstruction phase of a conflict. And during my talk, I'm going to be kind of shitting on the UN. I've worked with them, so I know kind of the internal mechanisms and kind of the work that they're doing. And I have a lot of criticism of how they work, especially in countries like Libya. And I don't really like this kind of sanitizing language of recovery, reconstruction, like fitting them into neat little boxes, because it erases the sheer violence and the horror that people have endured. And you can't just kind of undo that with like a framework and some funding to clean up a street and then declare a city as being recovered. And so there's an interesting paper by a researcher called Bart Clem. He talked about the problem of peace and the meaning of post-war, where he deconstructs these terms. There are no clear phases to a crisis. The lines are very blurry. And in the middle of the armed conflict in Benghazi, for example, people were constructing housing and developing neighborhoods while next to them was being bombarded. And now in kind of this peacetime that we're living in, there are constant conflict of a different kind. And so there's various power players who are reshaping the city through land dispossession and illegally funded development projects, and kind of making a new type of city. And so just to clarify, when I use the term post-conflict, I'm referring to the end of like armed clashes, the end of snipers on the roof and tanks in the streets and the state of emergency. But that doesn't mean there isn't a different type of conflict that's happening in the city today. So the conflict in Benghazi officially started in 2014. And here I say officially again, it was one side declaring war on another side. And that's when things kind of kicked off between the military groups in the city, the paramilitary armed groups, the terrorist groups who were all kind of vying to gain control of Benghazi. And it's a conflict that was a long time in the making. Going back to 2011, when we had the revolution and the overthrow of the Gaddafi regime, we kind of lived in this euphoric state that surely the hardest part was overthrowing a dictator. Building a country is the easy part. And then we were surprised when we realized that actually throwing the dictator was the easiest part. We discovered that different people and cities and ideologies in the country had all different ideas of what this new country should look like. This was coupled with a complete security vacuum because NATO had bombed a lot of military infrastructure in the country. And that gap of security was being filled by different opportunists who saw themselves as kind of jumping in and the next leader of the country. A lot of people talk about Libya today as though the two key events were 2011, we had the revolution, 2014, we had a war, and then that's kind of it. But those 3 years in between are really, really important to understand why Libya is in the state it was in today. There was this gradual destabilization. It was almost imperceptible unless you were actually in the country, where there were assassinations happening or protesters being shot at or civil disobedience strikes. And so there was this slow erosion that was happening of this perception that we had that we were a stable country. I wanted to share this picture with you. This was in April 2011. This was during a women's rally in Benghazi in front of the courthouse. At that time, the eastern part of the country was freed. Again, this is a very a very contentious term. We had kind of overthrown the institutions of the dictatorship. But the western side of the country was still under the Gaddafi regime. And so there were a lot of protests that were happening. There were a lot of stances. And there was this perception of unity in the country that we all want the same thing, which looking back on it now was not the case. Everyone had different ideas about what was happening. There's a lot of people who were against the forward intervention, against NATO, in support of Gaddafi. And we kind of weren't seeing those differences or that kind of like complexity in the situation. And I think that was also one of the things that really caused kind of the shock, the post-revolutionary shock of okay, well, we have these different points of view and we need to come together to build the country. But to go back even further, before 2011, Libya has never really been a stable country. We've gone from occupation to colonization to a neoliberal kingdom that sliced the country up based on the demands of multinational oil companies. Libya is an oil producing country, and the discovery of oil is described by many scholars as kind of the turning point in the country's history. This idea that countries kind of just fall into conflict or fall into instability is false. There is always an underlying sort of precarity, and events like a revolution or an occupation or even a pandemic, like what we saw with COVID, it begins to uncover that in its moment. There are more and more studies being done today on precarity in cities and precarious urbanism, and how communities cope in situations marked by uncertainty in day-to-day life, especially when this uncertainty comes from external influences. When you hear the word precarity, I think you imagine a sort of unsettling image of, mass homelessness or mass famine or some kind of cataclysmic event. But there are also micro precarities. There's the precarity of living in anticipation of something that's going to destabilize your life. It's the small things that build up. In the case of Libyans living under the Gaddafi regime, it was wondering if the next day the government would decide to pass a new law or a new policy declaring that, there's no such thing as owning more than one home. Everyone who lives in a home or rents a home owns it. And that's something that actually did happen, the infamous law number 4. It's about wondering if these intermittent power outages are increasing and what impact they're going to have and what it means about the energy infrastructure in the country. And so it's those little things that really build up and that keep people, at least mentally, living in a state of precarity. Abdul Malik Simone writes a lot about precariously placed communities and how also use formal networks to navigate unstable circumstances. And in Libya, this kind of informal navigation has been part of our lives for generations. It's something that I saw my parents do. It's something that I did. It's about, you can't really rely on the government or the authority or the decision makers. You have to rely on who you know and how you can solve your own issues. There's an interesting paper by an Iraqi scholar. Unfortunately, I forgot his name, but I'll try to link it in the chat later. It's called You Have Car Insurance, We Have Tribes, which talks about using tribalism as a way to protect yourself against kind of any situations that occur in an urban setting. And so that kind of like alternative methods has been part of the Libyan life for a very long time. It's not something that started in 2011, but it's something that we've seen for decades. Just to turn your attention to this map, this just kind of highlights the different kind of historical eras or historical moments and how they've impacted the growth of Benghazi's urban fabric. So you can see, for example, the city didn't really grow after 1992 when the world placed sanctions on Libya, because there was just so little room for growth and a lot of inability because we were isolated from the rest of the world. You can see how after the revolution, there's kind of been this explosion of growth because there isn't really anyone who is kind of enforcing zoning laws. So everyone is just building wherever they want. And so these moments of history have big impacts, but there's something that we tend to see after a period of time. And so I want to bring us back to the present day. In Benghazi, I'm in Benghazi today with you, and there's a lot of reconstruction that's happening. There's reconstruction that's been happening for the past 6 years or so, but there's also a lot of destruction going on in different ways. Whether it's the form of the erasure of cultural heritage or the forced rewriting of the events in the actual urban fabric. The reconstruction that is happening is very hazard, and a lot of it is being done by the people themselves. It's important to remember that Libya is still very much considered a fragile state. We have a political legitimacy crisis. We have groups who are all vying for power still. When we started to rebuild, it was almost in the complete absence of a state back in 2017. And so this like national struggle has meant that people, again, are relying on their kind of informal methods of bringing their city back to life. People have been fixing their own homes. Community organizations, neighborhood councils have begun to clean up their streets and to fix infrastructure. An example of this in my neighborhood, for example, the local electrical engineer would gather like a group of youth and they would go around and fix the electrical infrastructure in the neighborhood that was damaged in the war because it was something that our neighborhood needed. This image is of a bulldozer owned by a man called Louay Funes. He's now become kind of like a local hero. He would go and he would clean up the rubble and the debris in the city center, which was the area that was most damaged in the war. And he did it all by himself. He's a resident of the city center and he wanted to help displaced people go back to their homes, at least to access their homes and to see the damage and to begin to reconstruct. Again, this was all personal efforts. Another example here is the reconstruction of a famous plaza in the city center by a local organization called Benghazi Amal. The thing is also, reconstruction is also a very contentious process because people don't really agree on what reconstruction should look like. This was a popular project among the local residents of the neighborhood because, you know, they cleaned up the space, they fixed the building, they painted over the burns of the building, but then the kind of the heritage experts said, well, you didn't really like restore this the way it should be based on like official guidelines and restoration techniques. And so there is also this tension of what should reconstruction look like? Should we bring back things as they looked before? Should we knock things down and build something new? There's quite a large segment of the population who really want to see skyscrapers in the city center. They say, you know, want to be like the rest of the world. We want to be like, you know, we want to feel modern. And the Libyan image, modernity means skyscrapers. It means Dubai. It means, you know, kind of glass and metal city centers. And so this itself is kind of a conflict that's happening on the local level in the city. Teresa Caldera is a really great Brazilian researcher, and she coined the term auto construction, which refers to the way that people make their own urbanism, people building their own homes, paving their own streets, doing things that the state would consider informal, but it's also where the state wouldn't necessarily step in. In our case, again, there isn't much of a state to step in here. And so what is happening in Benghazi is kind of like auto reconstruction. It's people doing their own reconstruction outside of frameworks, outside of national visions. It's just people kind of trying to bring back their city in like bits and pieces. And so while doing all of this reconstruction, the world hasn't stopped throwing more crisis at us. COVID-19 had hugely delayed the reconstruction process in Benghazi. We're hearing about people being told to shelter while there are still thousands of families whose shelter was destroyed in the war. The Ukraine-Russia conflict coupled crisis has created more urgent spending priorities for the average Libyan, which means, people who are saving up money to rebuild their homes have to put that money towards, for example, increasing cost of groceries. We're also trying to reconstruct while the climate is continuously changing around us. And in Benghazi, that means there's more flooding every year, unprecedented levels of flooding every winter, which creates more delays. It means that the increased desertification in southern Libya is leading to more internal migration in the country. People are coming out to the north, to cities like Benghazi, and it's creating a strain on our already damaged infrastructure. You can begin almost to visualize these layers of crisis in a city the way you would visualize like a cross section of soil. It's just kind of one on top of the other. We're hearing about the different targets that countries are being given by international organizations to Libyan ministries or to civil society organizations. They no longer see Libya as an emergency situation. And Libya is a little bit of a strange context because we're not a poor country. We're a country that makes $150 million a day selling oil, but we're a country with poor administrative institutional infrastructure. And so how do we use this money in a way that it goes to where it needs to go? And so we are placed in a category that doesn't necessarily fit us. And we're being given money to do things that aren't necessarily the priority on ground. If you ask the average Benghazi resident if funding should go to climate change mitigation or to reconstructing the city center, it's not difficult to guess what they're going to pick. But both of these things are important. So it becomes a question of how do you focus on so many different issues and so many different crises with so few resources? And how do you justify your focus? Like for us, Libya as a country, how do we justify saying we want to prioritize reconstruction and not climate change without isolating ourselves as a country from the rest of the world? And I can tell you that the last thing Libyans want is to feel isolated again. It's something we've experienced over the decades, and we don't want to be seen as we don't care about climate change, but there's just so many other things. This picture here kind of captures what I'm talking about. So in 2017, during the sort of emergency recovery phase of the reconstruction process, the UN kind of defined phases. They decided that the best solution for Libya would be to flood us with solar panels. It ticks off their mandate of like promoting clean energy, combating climate change, but it also provides an alternative energy source in a country where the energy infrastructure is very weak or destroyed. So it's two birds with one stone, right? The thing is, when you parachute into a fragile country with a new kind of technology, you need to put the actual effort of introducing it and understanding how it's fitting in with the existing context. I worked with UNDP for a bit, and they asked me to assess the effectiveness of the solar panels they installed in 3 hospitals in Benghazi. So I visited the hospitals and I asked the staff how the panels made a difference to their work. And they kind of looked at me with confusion for a bit. And then like it slowly dawned on them what I was talking about. And they're like, oh, lack of boards on the roof. Yeah, we don't know how to make them work. We don't know how to plug them in. So this is like a very anecdotal story. It did actually happen. And in this European sort of the lack of foresight in bringing in new energy technology in a country where oil is heavily subsidized. oil in Libya is cheaper than water. Why would I learn to use a solar panel, learn how to make it work when I can just fill my generator and it costs me like what, $3? And so it's kind of like there's this image of like we're working on climate change, but really it's not fitting into the local culture or the local priorities. I don't want to take up too much more time, but I want to end this talk with sort of an invitation to rethink reconstruction, and especially in contexts of fragility, in contexts where the state isn't very strong, in contexts like Libya, where it's been kind of instability for the past few decades. To kind of like decolonize this idea of reconstruction and to situate it within the tensions between global and local trends and priorities. I don't have the answer because we're still trying to figure it out in Benghazi. It's going to take us another 20 to 30 years just to aesthetically reconstruct the country. So just to be able to like pave over all the bullet holes and all the missile leftovers. And then we're going to need a lot more time to recover from the social, the structural, the psychological impacts. And we're trying to do that in the midst of these new crises and these new kind of layers of anxiety that we're sensing with, again, climate change, with pandemics, with global changes in the world. And so what does reconstruction look like, not just in our context, but in all contexts? How do you kind of navigate these multiple crises while also trying to mitigate their impact and try to reconstruct and recover? I'm going to stop it here and pass over to Marina. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Nada. Thanks a lot. A lot to think about. Thank you for having grounded us into an interesting set of questions across time and space. So thanks a lot. Please think about questions and interventions and reflection. I'll be very happy to pass immediately the voice to Marina. Marina, the floor is yours, and I will look forward.
Thank you, Camilo, and thank you for the invitation, and also Nada for your presentation. So interesting and amazing work. Okay, I'm going to share a screen. Do you see the presentation? Okay. So today I'm going to talk, as Camilo anticipated, about lithium, and in particular, lithium struggles that are happening in Atacama, in Chile, but also in Europe, in Portugal. Recently, due to the energy crisis, the European Union has been incentivizing the opening of new mines in the European continent, and it's particularly in places like Serbia, Portugal, and Spain. So what was my focus? That for some years I was more focused on Chile and Atacama. I tried to make the connection of people who had been advocating against lithium extraction in Atacama in Chile with those in Portugal and Spain, because there are, even though that there are very particular and different contexts, there are questions that are shared and demands that are shared. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this, and also why I started to think of lithium. So I was interested in the idea of progress and how it has been often been used as a synonym of reaching new horizons. Obviously, that is very much connected also with technology, but also with architecture and urbanism, always advancing towards the better, the bigger, the higher, faster. And how bodies, and when I say bodies, I say also, human, non-human, and planetary, have been working on reaching their limits, no? Like they have been pushed to previously unimaginable accomplishments. But as the ecological catastrophe looms and Western notions of progress are being contested, this relentless search for more has been also critically examined, and humans' obsession with stretching the limits is not achieved without catastrophic consequences. Yet when we think that we reach these limits, our compulsive desires or the compulsive desires of certain humans and the appetite for more is channeled through new formulas to keep on. And lithium is one of those formulas. It's a natural element found in high concentration only in very few places on Earth. So despite that, they are also now discovering it in other countries. This high concentration happens in very few places, and one of them is in the Puna de Atacama, or the so-called lithium triangle in Chile, Bolivia, and Argentina. Lithium is praised for its capabilities to keep bodies and system on. It's used for batteries that are used also for renewable energies, but also batteries for our phones, our computers, data centers. But lithium is also used for mental health, for treating what was called mania and bipolar disorder. So in both ways, both to keep the energizing the body and keep the mood of the, like the planetary body, and keep the mood of the body attuned to the requirements also of the capitalist system. But in order to create these two components, both for the batteries and for the pills, especially for the batteries though, we have to go through processes that involve evaporating millions of liters of water every day in the world's driest desert, that is Atacama. In the Puna de Atacama and these Andean regions, water is the most crucial support for the human and non-human inhabitants. But as this water, the salares, contain high concentrations of salts and minerals, extractivist industries, such as the lithium one, are depleting the entire reservoirs. Not far from the lithium brine pools that we have seen, those beautiful pools, where mining companies are extracting almost 2,000 of liters per second from the deepest layers of the desert. Our millions of liters of water, I have said, are evaporated annually to run the smart city and host the metaverse. The Atacameño communities subsist through ancestral solidarity. This is Toconao. It's a small village that the name means place of stones in indigenous Atacameño language. The settlement goes back to 12,000 years, so it's an area of historical importance. And water is essential for Toconao and other Aillos in villages in San Pedro de Atacama. The waters are communal, very different from how is water managed in Chile, that is privatized. And customary indigenous norms apply for their administration. So irrigation is organized in turns by the Comunidad de Regantes, or irrigation community. Water is treasured, cared for, and redistributed to all members of the community through a series of water canals and ponds, whose maintenance is organized by this community. Systems like these barriers allow this flow of water to go or to contain. The traditional architecture of the region is also attuned to all the beings in Aillo. The houses traditionally were oriented towards the Licancabur, the volcano, who marks the start of the day. For centuries before construction, the Atacameños will make an offering to the land and ask permission and express gratitude. By doing that, they confront the notion that someone can actually own a place, its resources, and export them in exchange of profit. We don't own anything, we are part of everything. Rolando Humire, an indigenous leader and biologist, says, it is only with the permission from the spirits and the ancestors and Mother Earth that his community interacts with the land. Their activities are not based on taking, but primarily on caring and giving back. Atacameños know that the Atacama ground is alive, so are the water bodies. Crucial to the ecosystem safeguard is the recognition of the beings inhabiting that territory and the symbiotic relations between them. Flamingos, bacteria, humans, plants. For instance, Cristina Dorador, professor of microbial ecology, talks about the life in Atacama salt basins. She wants to create awareness of the importance of the cyanobacteria, these microorganisms that are fundamental for the ecosystem, but also were one of the first microorganisms on Earth. However, these organisms are degrading due to water scarcity and contamination resulting from the extraction of lithium and other minerals in the region. This is a cadastre and mining concessions in Atacama. It's quite packed. You can see how the Cartesian grid extends to these territories to, rationally divide it and make it available for extraction. Almost the entire periodic table and most of bacterial life that exists across the planet is present in Atacama. Despite its life and biodiversity, Atacama is generally portrayed as a desert, as a lifeless space, and one of the biggest repositories of mineral resources on Earth, and consequently, a major economic asset. So it's through this Cartesian view and understanding of the territory that life is portrayed as an economic asset. So SQM, that is one of the biggest companies that is exploiting this territory, is treating this ecosystem exactly at that, as a resource to extract and exploit it. And actually you see this entire area is owned by this company. So even though that there are different concessions, big companies have been holding on to these resources for a long time. To protect this unique yet very fragile environment for these devastating conditions and effects of mining, and the neoliberal economy that sustains them, is a task that has been carried out by many indigenous communities alongside people like Cristina Dorador and lawyers, architects, and many others. They try to denaturalize the understanding of the elements forming the environment as lifeless. One through cyanobacteria, the others through cosmic indigenous cosmologies and stewardship practices, claiming these elements as living beings, claiming that these elements are not lifeless matter. Against the images, aerial images that tend to see of lithium in the news, it's important to go to the ground and bridge the gap between aesthetics and politics. The aesthetic experience of this landscape often obscures the threat that these infrastructures pose for the survival of these entire communities and ecosystem in the name of corporate profit and in support of the belief that lithium will keep this running as coal or oil did before. Water is extracted at such a pace that directly affects the local aquifer, which leads to drop the water level in the entire region, not only the communities. When we travel to Atacama, we see these pipes carrying water from and to the mines. And obviously this is not unnoticed. This says that obviously the activities of mining companies in priorities like mining or having water actually for drinking, or like allowing all these communities to be in danger. So when we see these landscapes and the dreams that represent the dreams of, electromobility and the smart city, the dreams of the metaverse, the dreams of technology of progress that we imagine, we also have to reconsider what it takes to build our dreams. How these dreams and epistemologies constructed on cravings for productivity and profits are actually destroying the only world that we all share. So when we think about all the possibilities of places like the metaverse, we have to see how the digital infrastructure that goes from, our phones, computers, data centers, the cables, but also the extracting points, how this actually pose also a threat to the very territories that we inhabit as well, bodily. There are many communities who are protesting. So here they say, we don't eat batteries. If they take the water away, they take life away. And these communities are not the only ones protesting in Chile. There are communities protesting for instance, in the Netherlands against data centers, for which lithium are also an important component for the batteries. They are also protesting against the way in which digital infrastructures consume energy and produce water that otherwise will go to the communities. There are communities that are also protesting in the northern countries, especially indigenous communities, Sami communities that are affected by these green energy projects like wind farms, for instance, that are sold as renewable energy, but nevertheless affect the very ecosystems that where they have been living for generations, and their livelihoods depends on those ecosystems. And obviously back in Chile, not only in Atacama, but also in Santiago, where new data centers are being built. And obviously the country wants to portray itself as, this new space where not only having the components like lithium, but adding value to the production chain by creating batteries and having data centers, so concentrating much more digital infrastructure. There, the communities are also protesting and managed to stop one Google data center in the community of Cerrillos because it was consuming more water than the entire community. I'll go back to Toconao. This is the Comunidad de Regantes. I think for me, there is a very tension between, the way operating in certain communities and the way operating in extractive industries. And there is something to be learned. In Toconao, to prevent that anyone stays with water, no one will take water in a different turn or more than they have to, because otherwise the next one will not get enough. Limitless growth and the idea of progress as limitless there in Toconao, but anywhere else has never been an option, although we try to keep the promise alive. As the metaverse, the smart cities, and these low latency digital subjectivities expand, the turns of watering these lands in Toconao and other villages are getting farther and farther apart because there is less and less water. So to me, these two systems are, something that we have to consider. They are different worldviews, different ways of approaching, resources, understanding land, understanding our relation to the land, and relations of property and profit. Obviously, there is something very interesting there. And maybe, I don't know how I'm doing with time. Is it already too late?
No, you're doing very good, no problem.
Okay. So, as I said, these communities ask, bebo litio como cobre? Do I actually drink lithium or I eat copper? So these are the questions. What are the priorities that we want to put? But this perhaps paradoxical is that I said at the beginning, we do eat lithium as well. So we are using it for the batteries, but lithium is also used as an element for treating mania and bipolar disorder and other mental health issues. Very often is one of the most used elements because it's actually not patented, because it's not a formula, it's an element that you can find on Earth directly. So these two architectures for me, these compact architectures are very much representing a contemporary condition where we try to keep on. We are not realizing perhaps as much as we should, that perhaps what has to change is not the medium, the technology, but like the way in which we are attuned to the system. So if the lithium battery has these promises of keeping our consumption alive, maybe we have to reconsider consumption and not to put all the eggs and the aims in yet another element technology. In the case of the lithium pill, in many occasions, the management of moods has been also used to pacify and segregate different populations based on certain understandings of mental health, ability, etc. Also based in many ways about their productivity, how they are productive to continue serving the system. So, in fact, lithium is much more present than we think in that sense. In the 50s, 60s, it was used, for instance, in drinks like 7-Up that was marketed for especially housewives to elevate their mood when they were perhaps a bit depressed to be at home under like the patriarchy. I'm not gonna go deep in there, but it's very interesting. And the message was fresh up, keep smiling. And this was this drink made of lithium that will, keep you smiling when perhaps you could not. And more recently, during the crisis in 2008, there was some studies analyzing the waters in the tap water of different cities and the amount of lithium that was present. And there were some countries, including Greece, that consider adding lithium to the tap water to somehow change the mood or pacify the population that were under such pressure due to, the economic crisis and the different measures made by the European Union. So these some questions were present in this book that Camilo was naming. It's basically looking at these histories of lithium and the relation to forms of exhaustion and extraction of different bodies. And recently, as I said, maybe the territory changed because I started working in Portugal. I'm from the north of Spain, in Galicia, that is very near to Portugal, and many lithium mines are planned there. This is one of the sites where a mine is planned. It's one of the most biodiverse places in Portugal. It's extremely beautiful, and this entire thing that you see is going to be a big hole mining. It's going to be open mine. So it's not like in Atacama that is made by evaporation. Here is open pit. So this is in the center of the village of Covas de Barrosos, also a place of historical importance. And the company Savannah Resources has installed, a headquarters to convince the neighbors to sell their properties so they can go ahead with the plans of the mine. But obviously there is opposition. There's many neighbors that had end up become activists. I mean, they were working in agriculture, in farming, very traditional tasks, but suddenly they have to be confronted with that the mine will be 200 meters from their houses. So now they have become activists. So these are, again, people protesting these plans of extraction and how it will affect entire ecosystems, the water, noise pollution, many different lives that are there are also, disrupt completely the community, something that has already happened. So here you can see, like, again, it's water is life, and how these places will be affected completely by the opening of these mines for the sake of this green economy. And very quickly, just to say that there is something else in the water. So it's not only 7-Up, but actually the waters and the mountains that contain lithium in this region, they also contain waters that contain lithium. So it's not only through addition, chemically adding lithium to 7-Up, but for centuries in the Romans, this area is known by its geothermal activity and the thermal waters that contain lithium and other minerals that are good for health. So what was like natural springs, they coalesced in some fountains, later in more sophisticated architectural complexes made of thermal, where also aristocracy and the bourgeoisie were visiting for treatments, especially during the Industrial Revolution, where there was this idea of exhaustion at the bodies that are put to the limit, and they still are today. So this is in Vidago, in the north of Portugal, and you can see these fountains where these waters, lithium waters, emerge out of the entrails of the mountain, and these fountains celebrate things like fame, victory, glory, all through bathing and, drinking these waters. These waters obviously were used for bathing, but also for were bottled to commercialize, even today. So you can see the all form of extraction, something that was naturally coming out of the rocks, how it becomes one of the also biggest industries. And in fact, not so far from the advertisement from the 7-Up. So here also in this case, Portuguese woman like buying Pedras Salgadas in the supermarket and feeling very excited about drinking lithium. At the end, for me, what is important, and I'm finishing, is how this relation between bodies and the planet and how forms of self-exploitation and extraction mirror those of the planet. So how our entanglement between mining industries, but also the way in which we are mining and exploiting our own bodies through different acts, through different relations of labor relations, and forms of economy, but also through the notion, again, of progress as something that is limitless. This is one of the places in Covas de Barroso that is going to disappear in the mine. This summer, we were able to bath together in these waters that probably in a few years, if the protests are not successful, will disappear. But it was still important, even in the moment of a struggle, to find the moment to enjoy, to have an embodied experience of these landscapes, because this embodied collective experience are fundamental as well for continuing fighting for a better way of being in the planet. And I finish with good news, perhaps. Recently, because of protest, in this case of Atacameño communities, one of the tenders for lithium extraction was paralyzed in Chile. The new government, also Gabriel Boric, also is rethinking the way in which the lithium has to be extracted or managed in Chile, maybe thinking about a national lithium agency. But I mean, what I'm trying to say is that there are citizen movements that are able to actually transform or paralyze or bring changes into policies and in the way in which corporations and governments think. So this for me is that the revenge. So these are the cyanobacterias. I don't know if you know, well, that sometimes your lithium batteries explode. That's why you cannot bring them sometimes, put them in the bags in the plane if you check them in. And for me, this is the revenge of all the beings, like the communities protesting, but also the more than human communities, the cyanobacteria that keep alive in our phones and in certain moments exploit in a form of protest. So when you hold your phone in your hand next time, think about these lives that at the expense of which their battery of your phone exists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. So just to prove that the book exists, it's supposed to have my copy. So thank you very much. Thanks a lot, both. I have to resist making any attempt to connect the two or having something in it. But I was very pleased to, but also surprised somehow to see some usage of terminology very the same coming from very different geographies, of course, but also very different conditions of. You both spoke about choices, priority, and values, which are really, really a fundamental issue in relation to the way we conceive, imagine any design, of course, broadly taken as a policy, as a reflection, as a space, as an infrastructure. I think you both spoke indirectly and directly to resources and land specifically, but also the co-presence between destructions and constructions, in the sense that one is not unfolding without the others, of course, at different scales with different pace. I was remember while you were talking, and all what I'm saying now is just for you to take a little time to put the questions in the chat, and you find the courage to go to the microphone and ask questions and reflection, and you to breath a second, of course, to this idea of crisis somehow, never ending in some cases, or multiple and layered on. The beautiful Nada's descriptions of, you can find crisis literally in looking at the way in which the territory is overlapping, the space is reconstructing one on top of the other, but also the notion of crisis as choice. as possibility of choice. Really, one of the original definition of crisis is choice of going in one direction or in another, or what to do. And finally, this very interesting idea embodied in the progress that Marina, you were mentioning beautifully, and I think the connection with the pills and the mental, keeping up is super effective in terms of very kind of a psychosocial, somehow psychophysical version of the capitalist system. Remind me several reading of Moretti, of people, of Franco Bifo Berardi, people that were looking at that story. But this is another story. But and modernity and reconstruction. This idea of future as one direction, as given, as determined, I found it extremely powerful into the reflection. So anyone want to start with a comment? Either you yourself can, reflecting back, transgressing back to your own reflection, but specifically people in the room and people in the chat. I'm trying to keep my eyes into that. So really open for a conversation. Giovanna, do you have someone in the room? Oh, Nada, go ahead.
Sorry, I just had a reflection I wanted to share while listening to Marina's presentation.
Absolutely.
About this. Thanks. It's about this idea of kind of these natural resources kind of being used for the machine of modernity and of progress, and what Marina mentioned, limitless growth, and how it's creating this kind of sense of unsettling of space and of places. In the case of Chile, it's the water and it's the lithium, and in Libya, to a large extent, it's the oil. When oil was discovered in Libya in the 50s, the former king had said, "I wish you found water instead of oil, because water makes men work and oil will make them lazy." I think the difference here is that the water is a source of life in Chile. It's, as Marina mentioned, a shared resource, and the lithium also contributes to things like the medicine used to help treat mental disorders. In the case of Libya, the oil it feels like a curse. It's used to fuel machines in Europe. We don't use oil that much here, except in our cars. But we also don't have any other source of exports, except like 95% of Libya's GDP is based on the oil that we export. And so it brings us life, but in a very kind of destructive way. If the oil runs out, or if nobody needs oil anymore, then it will kill us as a country, because we just don't have any alternatives. I think also that comparison for me is a little bit interesting, of like shared resource that brings life and a shared resource that will really cause problems. And the other reflection, again, Marina was talking about this perception that Chile wants to give to the rest of the world, that we are a hub to support modernity, that Google can come in, that these companies can come in, and this is what we support. And I see that a lot echoed in the direction that is happening in Libya, not necessarily by the state, but even by the people, by this desire to want to contribute to this global narrative of, oh, we need, we want the metaverse, we want this kind of like progress of technology, and we want to be part of it. And so wanting to take part versus realizing what actual implications and consequences it will have for your own country, I think it's a very interesting kind of dynamic and a tension as well. Those were kind of my observations.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Super beautifully, you put it very beautifully. I think, for instance, this kind of what Enrique Dussel calls like this fallacy of understanding modernity as a universal form of governance that is applied, in all these places. And you show it very clearly in Libya, with the solar panels and all these kind of projects. This doesn't apply. And in this other region, you can see like, okay, there are many people, including people also in Chile, so this is not homogeneous, who are seeing like, okay, Chile has the keys to, the next phase of the world and the progress through green energy. And there are other people that says, I cannot drink lithium, so we are thinking about progress, but I don't have water. So it's kind of these tensions that are created. And yeah, in many cases, these resources are seen as a curse for these territories. And yeah, there's a lot of discussion about how to go about it, like if it's a national agencies, if a state, is a state organizing the management of these resources is going to solve this situation. Many people says that it's a neo-extractivism made in this case by the same countries. So how to go about that? How to deal with resources? How to deal with progress and modernity. So I think these territories are at the forefront right now of these tensions and are completely unresolved, I think.
Yes, you're right. Absolutely. Anyone questions in the room, Joanna? Yes, or in the chat. Chat, you please do. Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi both. Thank you again for both those talks. They're both really interesting. My name's Kayo. I'm a Buzz student. I have a question for Nada. It's kind of a question / reflection. It was interesting hearing about the kind of post-conflict, kind of things going on in Libya, and especially talking about exploitation of oil, etc. And I was wondering, have you come across the kind of movement going on in northern Syria called the Make Rojava Green Again movement? And if you have, do you draw any parallels from that movement with what's going on in Libya?
Should I just respond?
Yeah, I think it's better.
Yeah.
I think it's better, so we can. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for your question. I am vaguely aware of what's been happening in Syria. In some ways, the circumstances are very similar in the sense of cities being destroyed, of this tension between state versus local groups. I'm not aware of the project specifically that you talked about, but I guess there is kind of this thing in Libya where we see ourselves as a very exceptional case. I think for me, being able to do BUD helped show me that, this exceptionalism is a little bit kind of in our own heads because we've just been living in isolation for so long. I think there is a lot of parallels and a lot of lessons that we can learn between Libya and Syria, or Libya and Iraq, or Yemen, or the other countries in the region who have been going through similar kind of historic events. But we still have in our minds this isolation, this barrier of, what's happening here is just specific to here. We're not going to learn from anywhere else. We're going to keep doing our mistakes. So I think it would be important for us to kind of begin to build these bridges and begin to see what other communities are doing. With the caveat, of course, that especially in the Middle East and North Africa, these kind of relationships are also very political. The relationship between Libya and Syria today is based on how good of a relationship there between the military here and the Assad regime versus the rebels and the government in Tripoli, for example. So that also is very much fraught with tensions in itself. Of it's not just communities that can communicate with each other. There is that layer of the state or the people in power who kind of control who can communicate with whom.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting. Yeah, if you haven't heard of it much, I do recommend maybe checking it out. It's really interesting kind of hearing the way they're going about. They're talking a lot about climate change adaptation, and historically, I guess it's occupied by the Kurdish people, and historically they've been very kind of oppressed. So yeah, it's a really interesting movement, and it sounds quite similar to some of the things you were talking about in terms of troubles going on in Libya. But yeah, thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thanks. What's the name of the project again? Sorry.
It's called Make Rojava Green Again. They wrote a little book, and it's called the Internationalist Commune of Rojava, and I don't know loads and loads about them, but there's a book that they've produced, and it's really interesting, and it's kind of a rejection of the Assad regime, of the West, and of kind of capitalist modernity, and kind of trying to move forward in a more self-sufficient and using ideology called social ecology. But yeah, really, I'd recommend.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's it. There you go. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Thanks a lot. Anyone else?
Someone? Maria? So we have two. They have to decide which one goes first. Sorry.
Absolutely. This is a physical time to move to the microphone that help us to think. Is not a silence. It's appreciate. Hello, hello.
Hello, thanks a lot for your presentation. It's really nice to see how maybe we can go like after finish this course to do some of these interesting things and develop a lot of like interesting topics. So my question was a little bit related with the answer that Nara just was saying, and it's about like this connection, if you have found or some connections, some solidarity networks in the topics that you are being developed, because I think like, of course, every context is different, but there's a lot of learning that people that are like struggling can, like they can dialogue and construct some learnings about how they can resist. So if for example in Marina's case studies, there's some connection between Chile and Portugal and how that's working, and also like what kind of futures are these people imagine, because I think when you are fighting against something, at the same time you are imagining a different future, different from metaverse or this modern glass and steel kind of architecture. So what kind of future are these communities imagining? Thank you.
I knew that the difficult questions were about to come. So over to you. Marina, do you want to start? So another rest for a second.
Well, I mean, I'm very interested in this notion that Marisol de la Cadena uses, quoting Isabel Stengers, that is politics across differences, no? Like politics across divergence. And I say that because many times the alliances that are created across geographies and movements have to compromise certain aspects. For instance, I give you an example. The movements that are against extractivism in Portugal are generally leftist in terms of politics, but they are fighting against the leftist government. One of the, the Portuguese government is leftist, and against the European Union and the program of New Green Deal, which is kind of paradoxical, no? But they are aligned with many people from, the mountains who see the government and their plans to do the mining as very controversial, so they are voting right-wing. So you find very different tensions, politically speaking, and how, for instance, right-wing politicians take the fight against lithium in two ways: one, to attack the leftist government, but also to promote other fossil fuels again and non-green energy, because they use the work of people like me that are like criticizing lithium to say, well, lithium is not that good after all, so we should keep on working with coal. Similarly, there's communities of Covas de Barroso in Portugal. They have been in solidarity with the context in Serbia. Many of the protesters in Serbia are also politically more tending to the extreme right and right wing. So what is that they unite them and is worth the alliance? So what unites them in this case is the fight against extractivism. But you can see that suddenly there is a kind of very paradoxical situation in which, you see the causes of extractivism, but you see how, very different communities are aligned against a mine, but nevertheless, they completely disalign in terms of their worldviews. And this is very difficult, but at the same time, I think there are certain transformations that have to happen in the world that will only be possible and we do these alliances across divergence, because otherwise it's going to be impossible. So this for me is kind of shocking, and it's very difficult to situate yourself when you want to be an ally in those movements. I am an ally of what? But at the same time, it's like, okay, there is certain choices again to be made, and you have to find your way in what type of alliances and agreements you have to do for making certain transformations that you want to see in the world. So that's tough, but I think it's something that we have to discuss more.
Very important.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Nada.
Yeah, just to carry on from that, I think investigating kind of solidarity today in kind of our age of like extreme polarization, it is something that, you know, it's become a very kind of changeable and very dynamic thing. In 2011 in Libya, we had these bonds of solidarity across the country when we were protesting against Gaddafi, and there were these underground networks of support for protesters and dissidents and so on, and that kind of brought us together. But in 2014, when the war happened in Benghazi, those bonds became fractured because some people saw it as a war against terrorism, and some people saw it as a counter-revolutionary war to destroy everything we achieved in 2011. And so new bonds were formed by people who were formerly enemies, for example, pro-Gaddafi loyalists and those who were against the terrorist groups. And so it kind of has, I think, fractured all people's sense of how durable solidarity can be, and, you know, to what extent does this serve my own interests versus the wider interests. So yeah, that's as much as I can say on the topic. It's one that's very fraught right now.
Thank you.
We have another question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you both for your talks. I'm Akshara. I really liked the idea of having to navigate through micro precarities of daily life, like you said, Nada. And for both of you, I was wondering if you could talk a little more about the money that is made from the oil or the lithium. I'm sure both of you have tried to trace how it is actually spent and where it goes. If you could talk a bit more about how and why it doesn't reach the development projects and where it actually ends up going. That would be, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Want to start? Nada, you want to start?
Yeah, I can jump in. Just because in Libya, it's a very specific sort of mechanism. The oil sector is technically owned by the state. And it was one of the reforms that Gaddafi made in 1969 during the coup. He didn't want to see any more multinational oil companies controlling the country. And so the entire oil sector was nationalized. Any oil company that comes and works in Libya has to have 51% at least Libyan ownership. And so that was kind of done as a move to kind of show that the oil belongs to the Libyans. It's our resource. But then the problem with that also, one resource being managed by one institution, and the institution of the Gaddafi regime was one that was marked by paranoia and fear of delegation. And so it was really just being controlled by a very small group of people. This money comes in, they get to designate, and whoever has favor with the regime can bring some money to their city or their tribe or to their area. And that's kind of how it was happening for 42 years under the Gaddafi regime. It was this client-patron relationship of, oh, you know, I know you, I'm friends with you, you're my neighbor, and you're controlling some oil money. Can you please like pave a road in my neighborhood? Today, it's a little bit more complex. The single institution that controls the oil in Libya is the National Oil Company, the NOC. And the single institution that deals with the revenue is the Central Bank of Libya. And there's been a lot of effort to try and show that these two institutions are neutral in the conflict. They only serve the Libyan people. They do not belong to one side or another. That's the official sort of statement, but unofficially that's not true. The money is diverted based on who has favor, this client-patron relationship. And for Libya as well, we have this strange case where The oil money is used to kind of subsidize subsidize like the public sector. Like we have a huge sorry, increase in public sector jobs. We have more public sector servants than we actually need. And they get a government salary. And that's kind of seen as how the oil money is being distributed and given to people. So it's even in your pocket. It's not given in your urbanism. It's not given in projects, you know, very much it's inside of your own little bubble rather than as a shared resource. And that's kind of how the money is being managed now, the way I see it. But I'll pass over to Marina.
Yeah, it's very interesting to hear like the question of nationalization of resources and then what happens. So it's not necessarily the solution, but in Chile, Chile in theory owns the resources, but they have tender processes to have a concession for exploitation to companies. Some of them are national, like SQM, previously Corfo, but others are international, like for instance, this Build Your Dreams. They are working as Chinese and they are doing electromobility. So what the conversation is happening now is actually most of the value somehow is going out of the country because these companies extract the material because they have the means of extraction. It's costly to extract, but then they have the resource and then they create the battery that has an added value. So Chile gets the money from the companies to extract, but the other companies make the products that then are sold in the market and they have a higher value. So the conversation now, by the government, for instance, is how to keep somehow the value, adding value within the, Chile. Then there's a question of Atacameño communities. So until now, the companies have been giving money as corporate social responsibility. So you can see many projects happening, whether they are renovation, rehabilitation projects in the ageos, in the villages, but also, I was doing wine tasting in one place, and it's a winery organized by the indigenous communities. This project is also funded by SQM. So it's very tense relation, but at the same time, it's fair. So it's totally unfair because the indigenous communities will be the stewards of that land and sometimes are not even consulted. They are given some money, but one will claim if the economic profit is actually what is at stake here when entire ecosystems are degrading. But again, the communities are not homogeneous, so many people they have done agreements to get actually a percentage of the profits made by companies. So some communities are actually getting a good chunk of money. Again, I don't think that's the environmental damage and the damage that has done in the community is quantifiable in terms of profits, but this is how it's done. In the case of Portugal, it's tricky because the mines are still in process, but what they have been tracing, the people protesting the mines and the neighbors, is that are Portuguese companies that they can apply to European funding because Europe is actually subsidizing a lot of these projects for identifying new resources. But then if you trace them, they are very small companies that seem to be Portuguese, that are new, but they are actually holdings that are offices in London, but actually they don't even have an office. They then are related to Australian companies. So it's a big conglomerate. And most of them, they are not even interested in exploiting the mine. They want to speculate on it. They speculate on futures, and we are part of it. So as long as we keep on talking about the metaverse, like the smart city, all these developments, lithium and electromobility, electric cars, they have somehow they have the permission to explore, and they are asking for the permission to extract in that land. Probably these companies, they don't have the means to be extracting lithium, but in the moment that will happen, they sell to another one. So this kind of speculation is almost like real estate, but in terms with resources and projecting on futures and our ideas of green energy, green transition, and progress. So, and in the meantime, yeah, they give money to the local population to try to buy them out. Some of them agree because they are paying quite good money for terrains that are, rural ones, otherwise would not be so profitable. Many people resist. So it's still unfolding. I will tell you more next time to see what happens.
Yeah, I have like a
Thank you.
short one. I just wanted to know what percentage of lithium extracted from the world is taken from the Atacama Desert.
Most of it is the second place. I think Australia is the first. Or China, Australia are sometimes debating that, but Atacama is the second one. Apparently, Bolivia has one of the biggest resources. The Bolivian government nationalized lithium, and they have been accused, like Financial Times, all these lobbyists around the world have been accusing Bolivia of holding the progress and the green transition from the world, because Bolivia is not extracting at the pace that they expect. So Bolivia has also big resources. Atacama, Chile is the second.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Anyone else from the room? I can't see anyone in the chats. Otherwise, I have one maybe question. Can I go? You have one? Go ahead.
Hi.
Yes, please.
Hi, thank you for your presentations. They were both really interesting. I have a question for Nada, specifically, I suppose. So with post-conflict cities, some of the education I've had in that and the reading that I've done talks about, and I really resonate with the idea that the conflict isn't over when the bombs start dropping and people stop shooting. The conflict happens long before and after the official day. But I know that in post-conflict cities, sometimes you end up with these like parallel institutions and parallel cities in some ways, where one community gets to control a certain institution and sort of you rely on those networks if you're within that community to for your livelihood and for your jobs, for example. So one question is, do you see that in post-conflict Benghazi? And also, are there any sort of initiatives and projects that try and explicitly work in a cross-community way to try and halt this like parallel development?
It's a good question, because when I was working on reconstruction here on an institutional level, we had so many of these like parallel mandates and overlapping mandates. A lot of different institutions in Benghazi saw dollar signs when people started talking about reconstruction and being funded by the state. And so the municipality said, oh, well, we're responsible for reconstruction because this is our city. And the Ministry of Housing and Utilities said, no, well, all of these houses and utilities that are destroyed, it means I'm the one who's responsible for reconstruction. And then there's another body that was created under the Gaddafi regime called the Authority for the Development of Cities or something. It was like, nobody really knows what they do. It's a very secretive group. And they also said, well, we're responsible. And so what we were dealing with were different institutions all claiming to be responsible. They were all doing documentation of the kind of post conflict damage. And so there was kind of this repetition of mandates. There was this like fighting between institutions over resources. And you also had the neighborhood councils that were formed in every neighborhood, basically. It was people coming together. And what they would do is they would just negotiate with whoever would listen to them. So, if you're the municipality and, I know someone inside who can get me a meeting with the mayor and you're going to give me money to do, I don't know, fixing the water network, then I'll deal with you. And if the housing ministry wants to give me money to like repair some windows, I'll deal. So people were kind of taking advantage of that, of like, oh, well, I see you as the legitimate reconstruction institution. And then people were kind of just using that method to address those things. I think what's interesting, though, is that the strength of your ability to negotiate with institutions also came from which neighborhood you come from. So there were some neighborhoods in Benghazi that were associated with the terrorist groups because those were the last ones to kind of be liberated or for the fighting to end. And so those were in a way like almost punished. They were the last neighborhoods to get electricity or to get water because they were like, oh, well, you guys didn't do anything when we were fighting against these groups. So there's also a lot of these these narratives around who liberates, who defends, who destroys, and so on, that plays a role in how these institutions kind of help you. But the line between what groups of people do and what institutions do in Libya especially is very blurry. It's you know, I talk to you as a member of the municipality, but I also talk to you as my neighbor. And so you're also interested and committed to wanting to help this neighborhood. So there's a lot of kind of this playing different roles to get what you want. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, so I wonder whether I'm just posing my sort of last questions for you both to try to, you know, to say something final if you want. And the question you might expect is, what you think is the role of design at Broad in design education, design pedagogy, design practice, as far as that you want to take it, in dealing with this very deep, over-layered, transnational, transgeographical, transbodied notion of crisis. And this question is also connected to something that I think is methodological, because both of your work has been different methodologically speaking, through exhibitions, through research in one case, and through working, supporting with institution or with communities at different level. So I know it's a big question, but maybe lapidary or sort of very short, what do you think is the role and what you think are the different methods that we can use in order to do something? Marina, you want to start?
I think it's very varied, but I mean, that was my question when I also engaged with those geographies and communities. And, you know I have some skills also as a researcher or designer, but I was also concerned on how I can intervene. And I remember, Marisol, you asked the community that you want to collaborate with what they need. And I was like, no. So I think the first question, the first response will be like, well, we can do many things. And perhaps the first thing is also to ask like others how we can also contribute. And you will be surprised. But I know many people working as architects and designers. For instance, Godofredo Pereira, Tiago Patatas, and many others are working now in doing visualizations to try to explain how the mining is going to affect the entire region. So very factual visualization that explaining how big is going to be the pit, because the images that we have are coming from the companies, and the communities actually didn't have that many resources to do a environmental impact that will actually have the standard and the recognition of the authorities. So now many people, including designers, not only, are creating all these visualization, explaining exactly how the mine is going to affect the river, affect the air conditions, the flora, the fauna, and etc. So I think that's very basic. But I also have, for instance, one of my former students from the Netherlands, who is Portuguese, has been in contact also with this community, is going to be this summer helping to reconstruct, rehabilitate some of infrastructures, older structures that are in the village, to be able to accommodate people who wants to be there to support the community. So kind of a social space for the community to actually host all the people that want to show solidarity. So just to give you some possible examples, so from visualization, policy making, being able to do a report that will have legal consequences, to actually design spaces where forms of solidarity, alliance and collaboration can happen, which at the end are super important. And then wide range of things. And I will add, be careful with how we imagine our futures. I think to be at what is the cost of building the futures that we design, and be a bit more cautious. I don't think that goes against creativity and innovation, but in a way it has to go together with it.
Thank you, Marina. Thanks a lot. Nada.
Yeah, following that thought, so I think in a country like Libya, the kind of criticality in architecture is something that's still very much in its infancy. We're still very much kind of the traditional designer, practitioner, or education mindset of just, do what the client wants. So even, for example, saying no to a project on moral grounds or principles, it's still something that's still very new. And asking this question of, well, what happens? What happens when I build this? Who is it impacting? Whose money is being used and where did it come from? But I think kind of I don't want to say like the bright side, but kind of something, we saw from this kind of conflict and crisis is like everything has been changed. Everyone's kind of been taken out of their comfort zone. And I think we're seeing more of these newer, like younger architects who are beginning to question things, who are beginning to wonder why do things look like the way they are? Why are they graduating, working in a country that's half destroyed? And so I think having that unsettling is also good in a way because it's making people challenge the status quo in a way that they normally wouldn't before. So I think it's about kind of building on that momentum and building on those questions.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Marina, Nada. Thank you, everyone, for this great moment of conversation. I know it took a lot of your time and energy, but I'm very grateful for your thought in sharing pathway reflection. And I think this idea of unsettled definitely remained quite a lot to me, definitely for a few days. So thank you very much. And I really wish we could continue the conversation. I'm sure we're going to do it in somehow, but we need to probably get to the close of the session. So thanks a lot again. Thank you for your presentation, the time. And I really wish you have a very, very good afternoon ahead and weekend. Tomorrow is the weekend. So enjoy and thanks a lot.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions as well.
Bye-bye. Ciao a tutti. Ciao, ciao.